Dinner, that evening, was a subdued affair, the sort of meal that announces itself as obligatory rather than pleasurable. The dining room, all dark paneling and oils of long-dead ancestors whose expressions suggested they had found life disappointing even in their own lifetimes, accommodated perhaps a dozen covers, though only 5 were occupied. The colonel sat at the head of the table with the determinedly cheerful air of a man conscious that he ought to be maintaining morale. His wife, Lady Thorne, a creature of remarkable vagueness whose primary contribution to the conversation consisted of bewildered remarks about the soup course. A nephew named Adrian Thorne, whose fingers bore the distinctive stains of a man who worked with chemicals, and whose smile suggested he found human interaction generally amusing but fundamentally beneath him. A Miss Constance Hartwell, the colonel's niece, possessed of that particular English prettiness that consists primarily of good posture and carefully arranged hair, and finally, a Dr. Summerfield, the local physician, who had attended upon Frederick Carstairs in his final hours and possessed the satisfied expression of a man whose professional opinions had been validated by events. Whimsy, observing them all with the sort of attention that appeared to be casual disinterest, noted immediately that the conversation was being conducted with the care of individuals handling something fragile and potentially explosive. The colonel made several attempts at general discussion: the recent sheep fair, improvements to the South Meadow, a rather dull anecdote about the vicar's cat. But each attempt seemed to deflate almost immediately, as though the speakers lacked sufficient interest in their own words to sustain them. It was Miss Hartwell who broke the pattern, asking Whimsy, with the sort of politeness that barely concealed curiosity, what his interest in the matter might be. Before he could respond, the colonel interjected with an explanation that suggested Frederick Carstairs had been a relation of some sort, which was, Whimsy noted with quiet interest, a patent fabrication. The colonel had referred to him in his letter as an old friend and librarian manque. No relation whatsoever. The lie was small, inconsequential even, but it was a lie nonetheless, and Whimsy filed it away with the coldness of an entomologist pinning a specimen. It was Adrian Thorne who provided the second genuinely interesting moment of the evening. He had been discussing with a peculiar intensity some technical matter relating to chemical compounds when his aunt asked him, quite innocently, whether his work in the laboratory was proceeding satisfactorily. His response, a sudden shift to cordiality, a determinedly casual reference to his research as merely dabbling in old enthusiasms, suggested that whatever the laboratory contained, he would prefer it to remain undiscussed. Whimsy, who knew something of chemistry himself, observed that Adrian's hands bore not merely chemical stains, but the specific discoloration associated with prolonged exposure to arsenic compounds, a fact which the good doctor seemed entirely to have overlooked. The meal concluded with that peculiar English mealtime courtesy that manages to be simultaneously warm and glacial, and Whimsy found himself alone with the colonel in the study, a room that smelled of old leather and older regrets. The colonel, with considerably more directness than he had manifested at dinner, explained the true situation with the halting quality of a man confessing something that shamed him. Frederick Carstairs, it transpired, had arrived at the hall, ostensibly to catalogue the library, a project the colonel had conceived partly from genuine interest and partly because Carstairs had been in financial straits and required employment. However, within a fortnight of his arrival, the colonel had begun to notice certain oddities. Small amounts of money disappeared from his study desk, nothing significant enough to constitute a reportable theft, but sufficient to suggest pilfering. More troubling still, letters began arriving for Carstairs marked with unfamiliar postmarks, letters which he would read with an expression compounded of fear and something approximating satisfaction. Furthermore, and this was the element that had genuinely alarmed the colonel, he had discovered Carstairs on more than one occasion, standing in the library at odd hours, examining not books but the physical structure of the room itself, measuring distances with his eye, testing the soundness of the floorboards, peering into the chimney. Most peculiar of all, Carstairs had taken to visiting Adrian's laboratory, ostensibly out of scientific curiosity, though the colonel could not imagine what a 63-year-old librarian might have in common with a chemist engaged in research into industrial compounds. The death itself had occurred on a Tuesday evening, It was always Tuesdays, Whimsy reflected with grim amusement, when Carstairs had taken tea in the morning room whilst supposedly engaged in cataloguing work. The next morning, the housemaid had found him dead, the cup still at his elbow, his expression serene and utterly vacant. The doctor, summoned promptly, had declared heart failure with the confidence of a man who preferred not to ask uncomfortable questions. Yet the colonel, who had known Carstairs since their university days, insisted with the sort of certainty that comes from decades of observation that the man had the constitution of an ox, and could not have died of cardiac causes any more than a steam engine could die of consumption. There was, moreover, the matter of the tea itself. Graves, with his customary reticence, had mentioned that the cup contained a residue of something, though he had been too embarrassed to specify what. The colonel had asked the doctor about it, but Summerfield had dismissed the matter with professional brevity, suggesting that the residue was merely a consequence of the tea having grown cold and settled. Whimsy listened to all of this with an expression of courteous interest that concealed the rapid motion of his mind. The pieces were beginning to arrange themselves, not yet into coherent pattern, but rather like the scattered elements of a puzzle whose solution remained obscured. A dead man with mysterious habits, a nephew engaged in chemical research, a butler whose irrelevant comments suggested intimate knowledge, and cold tea. The details were there, waiting with the patience of stones for someone to arrange them into significance. He accepted a brandy from the colonel, congratulated him on maintaining such an excellent cellar, and allowed his host to believe that he, Lord Peter Whimsy, had come to Ashford Hall with the intention of vindicating the colonel's suspicions. In truth, however, he had come to discover something rather different, not whether Frederick Carstairs had been murdered, but why someone at Ashford Hall had wanted him dead so badly that they had been willing to risk exposure for the satisfaction of his death. The morning brought that particular quality of autumn light that makes even shabby things appear briefly transcendent, and Whimsy found himself awake at an unconscionable hour with the sort of mental clarity that comes from having slept in a room that smells faintly of lavender and mothballs. He dressed with deliberate care, country house investigate. Ions, he had learned, benefited considerably from sartorial precision, and descended to the breakfast room to find it occupied only by Adrian Thorne, who was attacking a kipper with the intensity of a man working through complicated thoughts. They exchanged the sort of pleasantries that English gentlemen employ to establish that they are not, in fact, savages, though Whimsy noted that Adrian's cordiality bore a faint veneer of wariness, as though he were uncertain whether Whimsy represented merely a guest or something more troublesome. Whimsy inquired, with what appeared to be genuine curiosity, about Adrian's work, and was rewarded with a detailed dissertation on the properties of various chemical compounds, delivered with the enthusiasm of a man who generally found his audience insufficiently educated to appreciate his research. It was during this discussion that Whimsy, with apparent casualness, mentioned that he had once collaborated on a matter involving the toxicological properties of certain industrial substances and had been fascinated by the variations in potency depending upon concentration and exposure duration. Adrian's fork paused, fractionally, between plate and mouth, a hesitation so brief that a less observant man might have missed it entirely, before he recovered with a comment about the unpredictability of such compounds. Whimsy, noting the response with the satisfaction of a fisherman who has felt a nibble on his line, allowed the conversation to drift toward safer subjects: the quality of the local water supply, the efficiency of the hall's boiler system, the curious acoustic properties of various rooms in the house. By the time he had finished his tea, he had established that Adrian's laboratory was situated in the old East Wing, that it was kept locked, that Adrian was the sole keyholder, and that the colonel had never, to Adrian's knowledge, entered it since its establishment some 3 years prior. Having thus satisfied his immediate curiosity, Whimsy excused himself and set about conducting what he described to himself as a preliminary survey of the premises, though what he was actually doing was examining every relevant detail with the precision of a man reading an ancient text in hopes of discovering some previously overlooked annotation. The library, where Carstairs had ostensibly spent his days, was a room of considerable proportions. lined floor to ceiling with books of varying age and condition. It was here that Whimsy's attention fixed itself most intently upon the physical particulars. The room contained 3 doors, one leading to the corridor, one to the morning room, and one, locked, he discovered, to what appeared to be a small adjoining chamber. This last detail proved interesting, for when he casually mentioned it to Graves whilst requesting directions to the morning room, the butler's expression underwent a subtle transformation, as though Whimsy had touched upon something ordinarily left unexamined. The morning room itself was precisely as one might expect, cheerful in the manner that morning rooms aspire to, with cream-colored wallpaper and chintz curtains, and a leather wingback chair positioned beside a window that overlooked the garden. It was here that Frederick Carstairs had taken his final cup of tea, and it was here that Whimsy spent a considerable period standing quite still, observing. The window was not locked. Indeed, it appeared to have been opened recently, for there was a faint, damp chill emanating from it. The chair bore the impression of a body, though whether Carstairs or merely years of occupation was impossible to determine. But it was the teacup, sitting upon a side table where it had apparently remained undisturbed since discovery, that commanded Whimsy's most careful eye. He did not touch it, such precipitate actions were for the impatient, but rather examined it from various angles, noting its thickness, its glaze, the precise manner in which the residue at the bottom had calcified. The cup itself bore a maker's mark, commonplace and unremarkable, suggesting it was one of many within the household. What was remarkable, however, was the faint, almost imperceptible discoloration on the interior rim, visible only at a particular angle when the light struck it correctly. It was the sort of detail that a hasty examination would overlook entirely, which was undoubtedly why Dr. Summerfield had overlooked it. Having satisfied himself on these points, Whimsy returned to the library and, with the sort of persistence that characterizes determined amateurs and brilliant detectives in equal measure, began examining the locked door. The lock itself was modern, recently installed if the bright brass suggested anything, and of a quality considerably superior to one might expect in a country house for what appeared to be a storage cupboard. It took him approximately 4 minutes to open it using the resources that he carried in his wallet, a skill acquired through circumstances it would be tedious to enumerate, and he discovered that the locked chamber was not a cupboard at all, but rather a small study, furnished with a desk, a filing cabinet, and a quantity of papers that suggested Frederick Carstairs had been engaged in something considerably more elaborate than mere library cataloguing. The papers themselves revealed themselves slowly, for Whimsy was a thorough reader, and what he discovered was a detailed correspondence spanning nearly 15 years, comprising letters to and from various individuals whose names bore a suspicious consistency with the current residents of Ashford Hall. Most intriguing of all was a ledger, neatly maintained in C. Carstairs' meticulous hand, which catalogued financial transactions, sums received, sums disbursed, debts contracted and satisfied, all arranged chronologically and cross-referenced with meticulous care. It was as he was examining this final document that Whimsy heard footsteps in the library, quick, purposeful, and accompanied by the unmistakable sound of Graves' rather labored breathing. Whimsy, with the presence of mind that characterized his approach to investigation, soundlessly closed the locked chamber and positioned himself behind the library door just as it opened, allowing him to observe, unseen, the expression of profound alarm that crossed Adrian Thorne's face when he discovered the inner chamber's door standing open. Adrian stood in the library doorway with the frozen posture of a man whose worst apprehensions have suddenly become manifest, and Graves, hovering behind him with the demeanor of a conspirator caught mid-conspiracy, wore an expression compounded equally of resignation and fury. Adrian's hand moved toward the inner chamber, as though drawn by invisible threads, and it was only then that Whimsy emerged from his position of concealment with the sort of casual deliberation that suggested he had been standing there for no particular reason at all. The effect upon Adrian was rather remarkable. His face underwent a rapid succession of transformations, beginning with shock, progressing through indignation, and concluding in something approximating defeat, though he maintained sufficient composure to affect surprise at Whimsy's presence. Whimsy, with the courtesy that characterized his approach to uncomfortable situations, suggested that they might retire to the study to discuss matters with considerably more privacy than the library afforded, and after a moment's hesitation during which Adrian appeared to be calculating the relative merits of flight verse. U.S. capitulation, the younger man acquiesced. Once ensconced in the study with the door closed and Graves dismissed, though not before Whimsy caught the butler's eye and perceived there a complexity of emotion that suggested the man's loyalties were considerably more divided than his service record might indicate. Whimsy settled himself into Carstairs' desk chair with an air of proprietorial ease that seemed to unsettle Adrian considerably. He asked, with genuine curiosity rather than accusation, what Adrian believed he would find if he searched the filing cabinet, a question that caused Adrian to sink into the opposite chair with the air of a man experiencing the sudden and catastrophic collapse of his defenses. It was at this juncture that Adrian made what Whimsy would later reflect was a curious choice. He chose to tell the truth, or at least a version of it sufficiently proximate to truth as to be useful. The story that emerged, haltingly at first, and then with increasing fluidity, was one of modest blackmail, though Adrian employed a considerably more genteel term, preferring to characterize it as mutual assistance between parties who possessed intimate knowledge of one another's circumstances. Frederick Carstairs, it transpired, had been acquainted with Adrian's mother, the Colonel's late sister, some 30 years prior, during a period when she had engaged in activities that her respectable family considered best forgotten. There had been indiscretions, the nature of which Adrian declined to specify, though Whimsy gathered from his evasiveness that they were of a variety that would have rendered her completely unmarriageable had they become public knowledge. Carstairs, possessing documentary evidence of these youthful enthusiasms, had maintained a discreet silence for many years, but upon his arrival at the Hall, he had commenced a subtle campaign of extraction, requesting small sums ostensibly for emergencies, proposing various loans that would never require repayment, and gradually establishing himself as an indispensable fixture within the household. The truly clever element of the scheme, Adrian explained with something approximating reluctant admiration, had been Carstairs' insistence upon documenting everything meticulously. He had maintained records of every transaction, every conversation, every piece of leverage he had employed, not as evidence to be used against his victims, but rather as insurance against the possibility that they might attempt to eliminate him. So long as his ledger remained secure and his location known, his safety was assured, for the moment he ceased to send certain monthly correspondence to a solicitor in London, the entire archive would be released to the authorities. It was a system of remarkable elegance, Adrian observed with a kind of grim appreciation, one that had sustained Carstairs in considerable comfort for a period of some 7 years. What Carstairs had not anticipated, however, and here Adrian's voice took on a note of desperation that suggested he was approaching the truly dangerous portion of his narrative, was that Adrian had begun to discover, through careful observation and surreptitious examination, the precise nature of the leverage being employed. He had found Carstairs examining his laboratory, testing the security of various cupboards, and making inquiries about the properties of certain compounds with a casualness that suggested he was not merely making conversation. Adrian had become convinced, with a certainty that appeared to border upon obsession, that Carstairs intended to employ Adrian's own research against him, to transform the chemist's legitimate scientific work into evidence of some far more nefarious enterprise. Adrian had therefore undertaken his own investigations, studying Carstairs' habits, his routines, his vulnerabilities, attempting to determine what precisely the man intended and how best to forestall him. It was during these investigations that Adrian had made a discovery that had altered everything. Carstairs was not, in fact, acting independently. There were letters, correspondence with individuals whose names appeared nowhere in official records, but whose involvement was unmistakable. There were financial transactions that suggested a network considerably more elaborate than a simple blackmail scheme. Transactions that hinted at organized criminal activity on a scale that rendered Adrian's own family troubles utterly insignificant. It was at this precise moment in Adrian's narrative that Whimsy interrupted him with a question of such devastating simplicity that it caused the younger man to fall silent. Had Adrian poisoned Frederick Carstairs? The question hung in the air between them with the weight of a guillotine blade, and Adrian's response, a long, careful denial accompanied by the observation that poison was a woman's weapon, not a man's, suggested that whatever the truth of the matter, Adrian was not himself the guilty party. Whimsy, rising from the desk with studied casualness, informed Adrian that he would require considerably more information regarding the identity of these mysterious correspondents, and that failure to provide such information would necessitate a conversation with Inspector McAllister that would prove considerably less pleasant than the current one. Adrian, recognizing the implicit threat with the clarity of a man who had just witnessed his entire world collapse into manageable pieces, agreed with what appeared to be genuine relief that further cooperation might indeed be the most prudent course of action. The afternoon had assumed that peculiar quality of suspended animation that Chirac. To rises the hours immediately preceding significant revelation, and Whimsy found himself in the curious position of possessing a quantity of information that appeared simultaneously illuminating and fundamentally incomplete. Adrian, having decided that candor represented his most advantageous option, had produced from a hidden compartment in his laboratory desk a collection of letters that painted a considerably more complex portrait of Frederick Carstairs than his surface persona had suggested. The correspondence revealed that Carstairs had been engaged for some 20 years in what might charitably be described as intelligence work, though the nature of this work and the parties for whom he labored remained deliberately obscured beneath layers of euphemism and coded reference. What emerged with unmistakable clarity, however, was that Carstairs had been in contact with at least 3 separate individuals connected to Ashford Hall, each relationship characterized by the peculiar intimacy that blackmail produces, and each transaction meticulously documented in his ledger. The Colonel himself appeared in the correspondence under the pseudonym Meridian, referenced in connection with certain financial arrangements made during the Boer War that suggested a considerably more complex relationship with military procurement than the official records indicated. Lady Thorne appeared as Aurora, with references to indiscretions that made Adrian's face flush with embarrassment as he attempted to explain his great-aunt's youthful enthusiasms. Most intriguingly, Miss Constance Hartwell appeared as Nightingale, though her correspondence was considerably more recent, dating only from her arrival at the Hall some 8 months prior, and suggesting a leverage of an entirely different character, one rooted not in past indiscretion, but in present vulnerability. Whimsy absorbed all of this with the attentiveness of a man reading an ancient palimpsest, each new layer of revelation suggesting deeper mysteries beneath. He questioned Adrian with surgical precision regarding the timeline of Carstairs' activities, the pattern of his communications, the nature of his interactions with the various household members. And gradually there emerged a picture of a man who had been engaged in what amounted to a carefully orchestrated campaign of extraction, each victim isolated, each relationship maintained in careful equilibrium, each potential rebellion forestalled through the implicit threat of revelation. What was most curious, however, and it was this observation that caused Whimsy to pause and regard Adrian with renewed interest, was that Carstairs' activities seemed to have intensified markedly in the weeks immediately preceding his death. The frequency of his letters increased, his visits to Adrian's laboratory became more pointed, his questions more direct, and his manner toward the household members subtly shifted from the discreet discretion of the successful blackmailer to something approaching open menace. It was as though Carstairs had been operating under some deadline, some external pressure that compelled him to accelerate his timeline and transform his carefully balanced system of mutual assured silence into something more overt and therefore considerably more dangerous. Adrian, when pressed on this point, confessed that he had noticed the shift as well, and had begun to wonder whether Carstairs' solicitor in London might have grown impatient with the arrangement, or whether some external party had begun to exert pressure upon Carstairs himself. This observation, innocuous though it appeared, struck Whimsy with the force of revelation, for it suggested the outlines of a considerably more elaborate narrative than he had initially conceived. Carstairs. had not been merely a blackmailer. He had been someone's agent, operating within constraints imposed by external authority, and his apparent confidence and security had been nothing more than the confidence of a man who believed himself protected by forces considerably more powerful than any individual victim. If this hypothesis proved correct, then his death took on an entirely different character. It would not represent the desperate act of a victim driven to murder by intolerable circumstances, but rather the calculated elimination of an inconvenient intermediary by parties who had concluded that his continued existence posed an unacceptable risk. Whimsy therefore posed to Adrian a question that appeared casual but which carried considerable weight. Had Carstairs received any visitors or communications in the days immediately preceding his death that Adrian had observed? Adrian, after a moment's reflection, recalled that Graves had mentioned something about a gentleman caller on the afternoon of Carstairs' death, someone who had arrived by private motorcar and whom Carstairs had received in the morning room. The caller had remained for approximately 1 hour, during which time Adrian had been occupied in the laboratory and had heard nothing of the conversation. The caller had then departed with apparent cordiality, and Carstairs had taken his tea approximately 2 hours later, alone in the morning room, where he had been discovered dead the following morning. Whimsy's expression underwent a subtle transformation, not quite amusement, not quite satisfaction, but rather something approximating the expression of a chess player who has just perceived several moves ahead and recognized the approach of inevitable checkmate. He rose from his chair with deliberate slowness and informed Adrian that he would require a detailed description of this mysterious visitor, a requiem. That caused Adrian to confess, with evident mortification, that he had not observed the caller himself and possessed only Graves' account of the man's appearance. Graves, Adrian explained with increasing concern, had described the visitor as a gentleman of perhaps 50 years, possessing a military bearing and a London accent, someone whose manner suggested considerable authority and familiarity with Carstairs. Upon hearing this description, Whimsy's expression shifted once more, this time towards something approaching grim certainty, though he offered no explanation for this transformation. Instead, he requested that Adrian remain in his laboratory and resist any temptation to examine or remove Carstairs' papers, a request that Adrian accepted with the gratitude of a man who has been granted unexpected clemency. Descending the stairs toward the drawing room, where the afternoon light was beginning to assume that golden quality that precedes evening, Whimsy found himself considering the probable identity of the mysterious visitor and the likely nature of the conversation that had transpired between him and Frederick Carstairs. The pieces were beginning to arrange themselves with considerable clarity, though one element remained obscure, the precise mechanism by which poison had been introduced into the victim's tea, and the identity of the person who had undertaken that introduction. The drawing-room presented that peculiar tableau of enforced domesticity that characterizes country house life in the aftermath of scandal. Lady Thorne was engaged in needlework, with the concentration of a woman determined to pretend that nothing whatsoever was amiss. Miss Hartwell sat beside the window with a book that she was not reading, and the Colonel occupied his customary chair with the air of a man experiencing the simultaneous weight of multiple crises. Whimsy's entrance prompted a subtle but unmistakable shift in the room's atmosphere, as though his presence had transformed some abstract anxiety into concrete peril. He accepted a cup of tea with gracious courtesy, an act that caused Miss Hartwell to look up sharply from her unread volume, and settled himself into a chair with the apparent comfort of a man without urgent concerns. It was the Colonel who broke the silence first, inquiring with thinly veiled anxiety whether Whimsy had discovered anything of significance during his morning investigations. Whimsy's response was characteristically oblique. He observed that the hall was a remarkably efficient household, that Graves appeared to possess an almost preternatural awareness of all that transpired within its walls, and that the morning room possessed certain acoustic properties that might prove relevant to understanding how various conversations might have been conducted or overheard. This last observation caused Lady Thorne's needle to pause fractionally, and Miss Hartwell's eyes to return to her book with renewed but evidently false concentration. It was at this juncture that Whimsy posed a question that appeared utterly innocuous but which carried considerable destructive potential had the Colonel, during his long association with Frederick Carstairs, ever noticed whether the man possessed any particular sensitivity to certain substances. The question hung in the air with the peculiar weight of apparent triviality concealing genuine significance, and the Colonel's response, a somewhat baffled assertion that he could not imagine what Whimsy meant, suggested that the implication had escaped him entirely. Whimsy, therefore, elaborated with elaborate casualness, mentioning that he had noticed certain chemical discolorations on the teacup discovered in the morning room, the sort of discoloration that might result from prolonged contact with certa in compounds, and that he was curious whether such compounds might have been employed in some beneficial capacity, perhaps as a remedy for some chronic ailment of Carstairs' constitution. This elaboration prompted Lady Thorne to volunteer, with what appeared to be genuine helpfulness, that Frederick had occasionally mentioned suffering from nervous complaints, for which he took certain herbal preparations. She believed them to be harmless folk remedies, though he was somewhat secretive about their provenance. Whimsy thanked her for this observation and allowed the conversation to drift toward safer subjects, though his mind was occupied with rather more pressing considerations. What had emerged, though not explicitly stated, was that someone within the household possessed detailed knowledge of Carstairs' habits, his vulnerabilities, and his likely reactions to various stimuli. More importantly, someone had possessed both the opportunity and the means to introduce a lethal substance into his tea whilst maintaining the appearance of innocent circumstance. The question that required answering was not whether such an action had been undertaken. The evidence suggested conclusively that it had, but rather who had undertaken it and, more intriguingly, why the Colonel appeared to suspect Adrian of the crime when the evidence suggested an entirely different perpetrator. It was this last consideration that prompted Whimsy to excuse himself from the drawing-room and request a private interview with Graves. The butler received this request with the stoic acceptance of a man who had anticipated precisely such an eventuality, and once ensconced in the pantry with the door carefully closed, Graves' demeanor underwent a subtle but unmistakable transformation. The careful servility that characterized his household interactions gave way to something approximating exhaustion, and when Say asked directly whether Graves had prepared the tea that Carstairs had consumed on the evening of his death, the butler's response was neither evasive nor defensive, but rather characterized by the weary resignation of a man who had been waiting for precisely this question. Graves admitted, with the careful precision of legal testimony, that he had indeed prepared the tea in question, though he insisted with equal precision that the tea itself had been entirely innocent. He had prepared it according to his customary routine, had ensured that the cup contained nothing whatsoever save the tea and hot water, and had delivered it to Mr. Carstairs at his request. What had occurred to the tea subsequent to its delivery remained, from Graves' perspective, entirely outside his purview. When Whimsy inquired whether Graves had observed who had placed the cup upon the side table in the morning room, the butler's response was characteristically oblique. He had not personally observed the placement, as he had been occupied elsewhere in the household when Mr. Carstairs had taken his tea. However, he had observed, upon his morning rounds the following day, that the cup had been positioned with considerable care upon the side table, as though placed there by someone exercising deliberate precision rather than casual placement. Moreover, and this observation was delivered with the sort of careful emphasis that suggested considerable significance, he had noticed that the morning-room door, which ought to have been locked, as was customary in the evening, had been unlocked upon the morning of discovery. This last detail caused Whimsy to regard Graves with renewed interest, for it suggested not merely that someone had been in the morning-room during the evening hours, but that they had deliberately left evidence of their presence. When Whimsy asked who possessed keys to the morning-room, Graves produced a list with the precision of a man who had anticipated this question: the Colonel, Lady Thorne, the housekeeper, Mrs. Pemberton, himself, and here came the crucial detail, Miss Hartwell, to whom a key had been provided some 6 months prior when she had begun to use the morning room as a writing room for her correspondence. This last revelation caused Whimsy's expression to shift subtly, and he posed one final question to Graves. Had the butler observed any particular interaction between Miss Hartwell and Frederick Carstairs during the weeks prior to the latter's death? Graves' response was delivered with exquisite care. He had observed that Miss Hartwell and Mr. Carstairs had maintained a cordial but distant relationship, characterized by the sort of carefully maintained civility that suggested either profound indifference or profound calculation. However, he had noticed that on the evening of Carstairs' death, Miss Hartwell had been occupied in the morning room for a considerable period, and had emerged from that room with an expression suggesting considerable emotional disturbance. The remainder of the evening passed in that curious state of suspension that characterizes the hours immediately preceding the final act of a drama whose denouement has been set in motion but whose precise mechanisms remain obscured. Whimsy dined with the household, conversing with apparent ease about inconsequential matters, whilst his mind occupied itself with the considerably more pressing business of assembling the final pieces of a puzzle whose outline had become increasingly evident. Miss Hartwell, he observed with the attention that had become habitual, maintained her composure with remarkable consistency, though her hands betrayed a faint tremor when she lifted her wine-glass, and her responses to casual inquiries possessed the careful precision of someone monitoring every utterance for potential incrimination. It was only after the ladies had withdrawn that the Colonel, with evident relief at being freed from the necessity of pretending normalcy, drew Whimsy aside into the study and requested, with the directness that comes from desperation, that Whimsy provide some indication of his conclusions. Whimsy, settling himself in the leather chair with deliberate slowness, informed the Colonel that he required one additional piece of information before his understanding could be considered complete: the true nature of Miss Hartwell's connection to Frederick Carstairs and the specific leverage that the dead man had possessed over the young woman. The Colonel's response was characterized by the sort of anguish that suggests a man contemplating the revelation of secrets that shame him profoundly. It transpired that Miss Hartwell, Whimsy's own cousin thrice, removed through a convoluted lineage of Thorns and Hartwell connections, had become involved some years prior in a romantic entanglement of the sort that society considers irredeemable. The gentleman in question was, unfortunately, already married, a detail which had not come to light until the relationship was considerably advanced. When the truth had emerged, Miss Hartwell had attempted to extricate herself with grace, but the gentleman in question had proven considerably less cooperative. Carstairs, who had been retained by the gentleman's wife to gather evidence for divorce proceedings, had compiled a substantial collection of correspondence, some of which was decidedly explicit in nature. Upon Carstairs' arrival at the Hall, he had begun employing this material as leverage against Miss Hartwell, threatening disclosure unless she could persuade the Colonel to provide certain financial arrangements that would facilitate Carstairs' retirement. The Colonel, unable to bear the prospect of his beloved niece's humiliation, had capitulated to the demands, though the payments represented a considerable drain upon his resources and a constant source of anxiety. What had altered the situation dramatically, however, was the arrival at the Hall some 3 weeks prior of a gentleman whom the Colonel had initially not recognized. The mysterious visitor who had called upon Carstairs on the afternoon of his death. This gentleman was, upon closer examination, none other than the Colonel's own brother, Edmund Thorne, who had supposedly died in India some 15 years prior, but who had apparently merely undergone a transformation into a different identity and engaged himself in the intelligence services. Edmund had come to Ashford Hall with explicit instructions from his superiors to eliminate the Carstairs problem, for the old blackmailer had become considerably too ambitious for his continued utility and had begun attempting to expand his network of leverage into areas that threatened matters of state security. Edmund had therefore undertaken to conduct the elimination in a manner that would suggest natural causes, and he had done so with the clinical efficiency that characterizes professional operatives. The mechanism had been elegantly simple. He had met with Carstairs on the afternoon in question, ostensibly to negotiate the terms of Carstairs' retirement, and had introduced into the conversation certain chemical compounds whose properties he had researched with considerable care. These compounds, which Adrian's investigations had suggested might have been procured from Adrian's own laboratory, would produce the appearance of cardiac failure whilst leaving minimal trace evidence for forensic examination. Whimsy listened to this narrative with the attentiveness of a man hearing confirmation of conclusions he had already reached through independent investigation. And when the colonel had concluded, he posed a question that demonstrated the full extent of his understanding. Had Miss Hartwell been aware of her cousin Edmund's intentions when she had placed the poisoned cup into the morning room? The colonel's anguished silence was confirmation sufficient, and Whimsy rose from his chair with the air of a man who has finally perceived the complete architecture of a crime and recognized both its elegance and its fundamental tragedy. The truth, as it emerged through careful interrogation conducted with surprising gentleness, was that Miss Hartwell had been presented with a terrible choice. Edmund had approached her privately and explained that Carstairs represented a threat not merely to her own security, but to matters of national importance. He had suggested that she might assist in the elimination by introducing a substance into Carstairs' tea during the evening of his visit, a substance that would prove lethal within hours, but which would leave no visible trace. He had presented it as a patriotic duty, as a necessity for national security, and he had employed every argument and pressure that his intelligence training had furnished him to persuade her compliance. Miss Hartwell, confronted with this impossible demand, and manipulated through appeals to family loyalty and national obligation, had ultimately acquiesced. She had introduced the poison, a compound far more sophisticated than the crude arsenic that Adrian had feared, into Carstairs' tea, and she had done so believing herself to be an instrument of state necessity rather than a murderer. What neither Miss Hartwell nor Edmund had anticipated, however, was that Carstairs' death would prompt questions, that a gentleman of Whimsy's peculiar talents would be engaged to investigate, and that the entire elaborate structure of necessary murder would collapse beneath the weight of logical examination and careful observation. The morning that followed Whimsy's conversation with the colonel presented itself with that particular quality of deceptive normalcy that characterizes the hours immediately preceding significant crisis. The household proceeded through its customary routines with mechanical precision. Breakfast was served, the post was delivered, and the various inhabitants of Ashford Hall maintained the fiction that nothing whatsoever had altered in the fundamental structure of their lives. Yet, beneath this veneer of civility, there existed a current of such profound tension that even the servants moved through the corridors with the careful circumspection of individuals treading upon ice of uncertain thickness. Whimsy himself appeared entirely unconcerned, occupying himself with the sort of trivial pursuits that characterize the leisure hours of the idle gentleman. He read the morning papers with evident interest, composed a letter to his mother with meticulous care, and engaged in a conversation with Dr. Summerfield regarding the efficacy of various herbal remedies for nervous complaints. It was only after luncheon, when the household had dispersed to its various afternoon occupations, that Whimsy sent word requesting Miss Hartwell's presence in the study, a summons that caused visible perturbation among the household staff and prompted Lady Thorne to cast anxious glances in the direction of her niece's bedchamber. Miss Hartwell entered the study with the bearing of a woman preparing herself for execution, her composure maintained through what appeared to be considerable exercise of will, and her eyes possessed that peculiar quality of desperate resignation that characterizes those who have been awaiting judgment. Whimsy, rather than commencing with accusations or interrogations, offered her a seat and inquired solicitously whether she would care for tea, an offer that caused a tremor to pass through her frame despite her evident attempts at self-control. Once she had settled herself with the careful deliberation of a woman whose nerves are operating at the extreme limits of their endurance, Whimsy began to speak with a gentleness that seemed entirely incongruous with the gravity of what he was about to articulate. He explained, with the precision of a man laying out evidence before a court of law, precisely what had occurred on the evening of Carstairs' death and how that terrible sequence of events had come to pass. He described the arrival of her cousin Edmund, the manipulation and coercion that had been employed to secure her compliance, and the introduction of poison into the tea that was meant to cause Carstairs' death. He outlined the mechanisms by which the poison had been introduced, the properties of the substance employed, and the manner in which it had produced symptoms consistent with cardiac failure. He explained his own investigation, the details that had initially seemed inconsequential but which had ultimately proven crucial: the discoloration on the teacup's rim, the acoustic properties of the morning room, Graves' observation regarding the unlocked door, and the subtle pattern of Miss Hartwell's emotional disturbance following the evening in question. Most crucially, he explained his understanding of the pressures that had been brought to bear upon her, the impossible choice that had been presented, and the manner in which she had been manipulated through appeals to duty and family loyalty into becoming an instrument of murder. As he spoke, Miss Hartwell's composure underwent a gradual but unmistakable disintegration. Her hands, which had been folded with careful precision in her lap, began to tremble. Her breathing, which had been shallow and controlled, became irregular and labored. And finally, when Whimsy reached the point in his narrative where he described the moment at which he had introduced the poison into the teacup, she collapsed entirely, her composure shattering like porcelain beneath hammer blows. What emerged through her anguished admission was a narrative of manipulation so calculated and so thorough that it cast into sharp relief the true nature of the crime that had been committed. Edmund Thorne had not merely eliminated an inconvenient blackmailer, he had created a situation in which an innocent young woman had been forced to become a murderer, thereby securing her complicity and ensuring her permanent silence. The brilliance and the absolute corruption of the scheme lay in its very structure. Miss Hartwell could never reveal the truth without condemning herself, and Edmund would be protected not merely by her silence but by her desperate desire to conceal her own culpability. Whimsy listened to her confession with an expression that mingled sympathy with something approximating anger, and when she had concluded, spent and broken by the weight of her own revelation, he posed to her a question of such devastating simplicity that it seemed to crystallize the entire moral dimension of the crime. Did she understand that Edmund Thorne had engineered her destruction as carefully and deliberately as he had engineered Carstairs' death? That in forcing her to become a murderer, he had accomplished something far more profound than the mere elimination of an inconvenient blackmailer? That he had transformed her, through manipulation and coercion, into something she could never recover from? Miss Hartwell's response was a silence so complete that it seemed to contain within it the full weight of her understanding. Whimsy rose from his chair and informed her, with a coldness that contrasted sharply with his earlier gentleness, that the time had come to determine how justice might be served in a situation where all the conventional avenues appeared to lead toward outcomes that were simultaneously necessary and profoundly unjust. He proposed a course of action that would require considerable courage on her part, a course that would necessitate confronting both her cousin Edmund and the full machinery of law enforcement, a course whose outcome remained uncertain, but which represented the only path toward anything approximating redemption. The telegram arrived at precisely 4 o'clock on the afternoon following Whimsy's conversation with Miss Hartwell, delivered by the postboy with the significance of a document that might alter the trajectory of lives. It was addressed to the Colonel and bore the signature of Edmund Thorne, indicating that he would be arriving at Ashford Hall by the evening train, ostensibly to attend to some family business that required his immediate attention. The timing of this arrival was not, Whimsy reflected with grim appreciation, accidental. Edmund would have perceived, through whatever intelligence channels remained available to him, that certain inquiries were being made regarding Carstairs' death, and he would have concluded that his presence at the hall was necessary to manage the situation. What Edmund could not have anticipated was that his arrival had been arranged through Whimsy's own intervention, a subtle manipulation of circumstance conducted through a telephone conversation with a contact at the Foreign Office who owed Whimsy certain favors accumulated over years of discreet cooperation. The preparation for Edmund's arrival was conducted with theatrical precision. Whimsy arranged for Miss Hartwell to be positioned in the morning room where she would wait, in a state of deliberately orchestrated anxiety, her composure fragile enough to suggest that she might capitulate entirely to Edmund's inevitable pressure. He ensured that the teacup, the original vessel from which Carstairs had drunk, now carefully preserved, was placed upon the side table with conspicuous prominence, a detail that would inevitably draw Edmund's attention and prompt certain uncomfortable questions. He positioned himself and the colonel in the adjoining library, separated a morning room by a locked door, but possessed of sufficient acoustic properties that their conversation would be clearly audible to anyone positioned within earshot. Most crucially, he arranged for a constable to be stationed in the servants' passage, ostensibly engaged in innocent inquiry regarding household matters, but in fact poised to prevent Edmund's departure should circumstances necessitate such intervention. Edmund Thorne arrived at the hall in the early evening, descended from a motor car with the bearing of a man accustomed to command, and presented himself to the colonel with a cordiality that barely concealed the underlying calculation of his manner. He was indeed, as Adrian had described, a gentleman of perhaps 50 years with a military bearing that suggested considerable service in positions of authority. His greeting to the colonel was affectionate but perfunctory, that of a man executing a predetermined performance, rather than expressing genuine familial sentiment. When informed that Miss Hartwell was in the morning room and might benefit from his counsel regarding certain family matters, Edmund proceeded directly to that location with the assurance of someone following a script already memorized. Whimsy, observing from the library, heard the initial exchange of pleasantries through the intervening door, heard Edmund's voice shift to something cooler and more commanding as he perceived Miss Hartwell's emotional disturbance, and heard the moment at which Edmund began his inevitable application of pressure. The conversation that ensued was a masterpiece of manipulation conducted by a man trained in the art of psychological coercion. Edmund began by expressing his concern regarding Miss Hartwell's emotional state, then progressed to more direct observations regarding her apparent anxiety, and finally arrived at the crucial matter, had she been speaking with Lord Peter Wimsey regarding certain regrettable events that had transpired. Miss Hartwell, as arranged, confessed that she had indeed spoken with Wimsey, that Wimsey had demonstrated a comprehensive understanding of the circumstances surrounding Carstairs' death, and that she had found herself unable to maintain her silence any longer. Edmund's response was a calculated progression from reasoned argument to implicit threat. He explained, with the cold logic of a trained operative, that her confession represented not merely a betrayal of family loyalty, but a catastrophic error in judgment. He outlined with meticulous precision the legal consequences that would befall her should she persist in her confession, the absolute certainty of criminal conviction, the lengthy imprisonment that would necessarily follow. He then shifted his approach, appealing to her sense of duty to the family, to the colonel's reputation, to the broader implications for national security that would follow from public revelation of his intelligence activities. It was precisely at this moment, when Edmund had completed his initial assault and was beginning his more subtle application of psychological pressure, that Wimsey entered the morning room with a sort of casual ease that suggested he had merely been passing through the hall and had decided, on impulse, to inquire whether everyone was engaged in pleasant conversation. The effect of his appearance was precisely calibrated to produce maximum psychological disruption. Edmund's face underwent a rapid succession of transformations. Surprise gave way to calculation, which in turn yielded to something approximating fury barely suppressed beneath a veneer of professional courtesy. Edmund recognized immediately that his position had fundamentally altered, that whatever manipulation he had intended to apply to Miss Hartwell had been rendered irrelevant by Wimsey's presence and participation. Wimsey settled himself into a chair with deliberate casualness and remarked, with an air of genuine curiosity, that he had been hoping for an opportunity to speak with Edmund regarding certain aspects of the Carstairs matter that had proven somewhat perplexing. He explained, with the precision of a man laying out a logical argument before an academic audience, that he had initially believed the murder to represent the work of someone within the household, driven by personal motive and operating under considerable emotional strain. However, Further investigation had suggested a considerably more elaborate explanation, that Carstairs' death represented a professional elimination conducted by someone possessed of training in such matters, someone operating under instructions from external authority, and someone possessed of the sort of access to sophisticated compounds that suggested institutional resources. The true brilliance of the crime, Whimsy continued, lay not in its execution, but in its misdirection. By engineering Miss Hartwell's participation and securing her complicity through manipulation, Edmund had created a situation in which any investigation would inevitably focus upon her as the primary suspect, thereby protecting his own involvement from scrutiny. It was a piece of psychological engineering so calculated and so cruel that it revealed considerably more about Edmund's character than any conventional confession might have done. Edmund's response was a silence so profound that it seemed to contain within it the full recognition of his exposure. When he finally spoke, his voice possessed the quality of a man who has exhausted his conventional resources and been forced to acknowledge defeat. "You are remarkably perceptive, Lord Peter, though I wonder whether you have considered the implications of pursuing this matter further." Whimsy's response to Edmund's implicit threat was delivered with the sort of calm detachment that suggests a man confronting an adversary whose ultimate defeat has already been determined by forces beyond their mutual control. He observed, with genuine courtesy, that he had indeed considered the implications with considerable thoroughness, and that he had arrived at conclusions that rendered Edmund's threat rather less efficacious than Edmund appeared to believe. "The matter," Whimsy explained, "was not merely one of establishing who had poisoned Frederick Carstairs, but rather of understanding the precise nature of the institutional authority for which Edmund had been operating, and the manner in which that authority might respond to the exposure of its operatives' actions. He had therefore taken the liberty, prior to Edmund's arrival, of composing a detailed account of the entire affair, including Edmund's involvement, the institutional pressure that had been brought to bear upon Miss Hartwell, and the calculated nature of the manipulation that had been employed, and of forwarding this account to certain individuals at the Foreign Office whose interest in the matter was considerably more than academic. Moreover, he continued with relentless precision, he had ensured that should anything untoward befall either himself or Miss Hartwell, or should Edmund attempt to flee the jurisdiction, this account would be released not merely to the police but to the press, thereby creating precisely the sort of public scandal that the intelligence services were most anxious to avoid. Edmund's expression underwent a subtle transformation, his calculated menace giving way to something approximating grim acknowledgement. He rose from his chair with deliberate slowness and moved toward the window, ostensibly to gaze out upon the darkening garden, but in fact to consider precise parameters of his remaining options. When he turned back to face Whimsy, his demeanor had undergone a complete metamorphosis. The threatening operative had been replaced by something approximating a weary professional, a man who recognized the game had been lost and who was attempting to negotiate the terms of his defeat. Edmund began to speak, not with the aggressive certainty that had characterized his earlier exchanges with Miss Hartwell, but with the exhausted candor of a man who had spent decades operating in the shadows and who had finally encountered a force he could not manipulate. He explained that the decision to eliminate Carstairs had not originated with him, but had been handed down through the chain of command, that Carstairs had become a liability precisely because he had attempted to expand his blackmail network into areas that threatened ongoing intelligence operations. Carstairs had begun to acquire information regarding certain covert activities, information that he had been attempting to leverage for considerably larger financial settlements. The intelligence services had concluded that his elimination was necessary, and Edmund had been selected to conduct the operation because he possessed both the skills and the family connection that would allow him access to the hall and its inhabitants. What had been intended as a straightforward professional elimination had been complicated by the necessity of making it appear a natural death, a requirement that had forced Edmund to engage Miss Hartwell as an unwitting accomplice. He had not intended, Edmund insisted with what appeared to be genuine conviction, to cause her the psychological damage that had resulted from her complicity. He had believed that, once the matter was concluded, she would be able to convince herself that her actions had been necessary for national security, that she would be able to rationalize her participation as patriotic duty. What he had not anticipated was that the presence of someone of Whimsy's peculiar talents would force a reckoning with the actual nature of what had occurred. Whimsy listened to this explanation with the attentiveness of a man extracting confession from an adversary, and when Edmund had concluded, he posed a question that cut directly to the moral core of the matter. Did Edmund genuinely believe that national security justified the transformation of an innocent young woman into an instrument of murder? That patriotic duty encompassed the psychological destruction of those whom one purported to protect? Edmund's response was a long silence, and in that silence there lay the full recognition of the absolute corruption of the position he had been defending. When he finally spoke, his voice possessed a quality approximating something genuine. "No, but I have spent so long convincing myself that such compromises are necessary that I have forgotten how to distinguish between necessity and rationalization." It was at this precise moment that the colonel, who had been listening from the adjoining library, emerged through the connecting door, his expression characterized by a complexity of emotion that suggested simultaneous anger, sorrow, and the peculiar grief that comes from recognizing fundamental betrayal by someone one has believed dead and thereby transformed into an abstraction rather than a flawed human being. The colonel regarded his brother with an intensity that suggested 30 years of unresolved history were being reconsidered in light of Edmund's true nature, and when he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of finality. "I believed you dead, Edmund. I grieved for you. I built a kind of shrine to your memory, imagining you as noble and damaged rather than acknowledging what you have become. I think perhaps it would have been better if you had actually died in India." Edmund's response was to sink back into his chair, and in that posture there lay the recognition that he had been reduced from operative and manipulator to something considerably smaller, a man confronting the ruins of his own moral architecture. Whimsy, observing this scene with the detachment of an observer who has engineered precisely such a confrontation, made a telephone call to the constable positioned in the servants' passage, requesting that he present himself in the morning room and take into custody one Edmund Thorne, to be held pending communication with the appropriate authorities regarding his disposition. As the constable entered, and Edmund submitted without resistance to the procedures of apprehension, Whimsy found himself considering the peculiar nature of justice in cases where the conventional law appeared simultaneously necessary and profoundly inadequate to address the actual damage that had been inflicted. The matter of Miss Hartwell's disposition proved considerably more complex than the straightforward legal mechanisms that typically govern criminal procedure. Inspector McAllister arrived at Ashford Hall the following morning with a constable and a manner suggesting considerable bewilderment at the telegraphic summary Whimsy had provided regarding the case. Upon examining the evidence, the poisoned teacup, Carstairs' ledger, the correspondence detailing Edmund's involvement, and most crucially, Miss Hartwell's own statement, McAllister found himself confronting a situation that transcended the conventional boundaries of provincial criminal investigation. The involvement of the intelligence services created complications that extended far beyond the capacity of local law enforcement to address, and it became evident that the matter would require intervention from considerably more elevated official channels. Whimsy, recognizing the inspector's discomfort, facilitated a conversation between McAllister and certain contacts at Scotland Yard who possessed the necessary authority and discretion to navigate the peculiar political dimensions that the case had acquired. The result was a resolution that satisfied neither conventional justice nor complete exoneration, but which represented the sort of pragmatic compromise that characterizes the actual resolution of cases involving matters of state security. Edmund Thorne, it was determined, would be detained pending psychiatric evaluation, ostensibly regarding his fitness to stand trial, though everyone involved understood that this represented diplomatic language masking a decision that the intelligence services would prefer to resolve the matter quietly rather than subject their operational methods to public scrutiny. Miss Hartwell, meanwhile, was to be offered a choice. she could insist upon prosecution, thereby ensuring her own conviction and lengthy imprisonment, whilst simultaneously exposing the intelligence services to considerable embarrassment. Or she could accept a conditional pardon contingent upon her absolute silence regarding the circumstances of her involvement and her agreement to leave England permanently. The offer represented a species of coercion so calculated that it made Edmund's manipulation appear almost innocent by comparison, and yet it represented the only realistic avenue by which Miss Hartwell might avoid the absolute destruction that formal prosecution would entail. It was in his final conversation with Miss Hartwell, conducted in the drawing-room with the afternoon light casting long shadows across the furniture, that Whimsy addressed the full moral complexity of her situation. He explained, with the gentleness that characterized his approach to matters touching human regility, that he understood the impossible position in which she had been placed, that he recognized the coercion through which her participation had been secured, and that he held her entirely blameless for the circumstances that had forced her into complicity. However, he continued with a coldness that contrasted sharply with his earlier compassion. The law operated according to principles that took no account of psychological manipulation or institutional pressure. From a strictly legal perspective, she had poisoned Frederick Carstairs, regardless of the circumstances that had motivated her action. The choice before her was therefore one between accepting permanent exile and the possibility of rebuilding her life elsewhere, or remaining in England and submitting to the machinery of justice that would inevitably destroy her. Miss Hartwell listened to this exposition with tears streaming down her face, and when Whimsy had concluded, she asked a single question that seemed to encapsulate the entire tragedy of her situation. Was there no possibility of redemption? Whimsy's response was delivered with the sort of brutal honesty that characterizes his most profound moments. Redemption, he explained, was a theological concept rather than a legal one. The law could offer punishment, forgiveness, or institutional compromise, but redemption, the transformation of guilt into something approaching expiation, required the passage of considerable time and the reconstruction of one's entire understanding of oneself and one's capacity for moral agency. She would have to leave England, accept a new identity in some location distant from the scenes of her former life, and spend years or decades attempting to reconcile herself with the knowledge of what she had done and why. There was no shortcut to that process, no legal mechanism that could abbreviate it, no eloquence that could transform it into something less painful. When Miss Hartwell departed Ashford Hall 3 days later, boarding a ship bound for Canada with a small quantity of luggage and a considerably reduced allowance, provided through the Colonel's discretionary financial resources, she did so with the bearing of a woman who had accepted the full weight of consequences, and who possessed at least a faint hope that distance and time might render that weight somehow manageable. The Colonel watched her departure from the window of the study with an expression that suggested simultaneous loss and recognition that some forms of tragedy can be neither prevented nor ultimately resolved. It was only after Miss Hartwell had gone, after Edmund had been removed to a secure facility in London, and after Inspector McAllister had filed his official report concluding that Frederick Carstairs had died of natural causes complicated by undetermined factors, that Whimsy found himself alone with the Colonel for a final conversation. The Colonel asked him, with the directness of a man who has learned that circumlocution cannot obscure difficult truths, whether Whimsy believed justice had been served. Whimsy's response was characteristically oblique. He observed that justice, in the conventional sense, required a victim, a perpetrator, and a clear causal chain connecting the two. In the matter before them, however, all three parties, Carstairs the blackmailer, Miss Hartwell the reluctant accomplice, and Edmund the professional operative, possessed simultaneously the qualities of victim and perpetrator, their actions and motivations so intertwined that assigning blame became an exercise in arbitrary moral judgment rather than objective legal assessment. The law, he continued, was a blunt instrument designed to address clear cases of wrongdoing, but reality presented a considerably more ambiguous terrain in which each motivations overlapped, in which coercion operated at multiple levels, and in which the distinction between necessity and rationalization became impossible to maintain. If anything, he concluded, the case demonstrated the limitations of legal mechanisms in addressing crimes rooted in institutional failure and psychological manipulation rather than simple human vice. The colonel seemed to accept this philosophical resolution with the resignation of a man who had long since accepted that the world operated according to principles considerably more complex than conventional morality could accommodate. Wimsey departed Ashford Hall the following morning, boarding the train to London with the air of a man returning to familiar territory after extended exposure to the darker aspects of human nature. As the village receded into the distance, he reflected upon the peculiar architecture of the crime he had unraveled, a murder that was simultaneously an act of necessity and of absolute corruption, conducted by a man trained in the mechanics of violence, yet driven by institutional loyalty rather than personal malice, and enabled by the manipulation of an innocent woman whose complicity rendered her simultaneously criminal and victim. He settled himself into his railway compartment and composed a brief note to his mother, observing that the Cotswolds, whilst possessed of considerable scenic charm, harboured secrets sufficiently dark to render the region considerably less appealing than its pastoral reputation suggested.